Jai Hind, Jai Bharat, and welcome to Dev Talks. This is Aadi. The Ukraine war is something that I've been personally interested since the war started because I kind of felt that this war has a lot more happening to it than we can see on the battleground. We have a whole set of events which is happening on the battlefield. There's counter-offensives, there's that and the other. But there's a geopolitical aspect to it. There's a larger aspect to it. What's going to happen to this war? What's going to happen to the participants in this war? And can this war come to a point where both the parties could meet and create some sort of an understanding? And that's something that I'm going to discuss with Brigadier Arun Sahgal. Sir, good afternoon and welcome to the show. We've always had a very interesting differential opinion from you, and I look forward for a very, very unique point of view today as well.
Thank you very much, sir. It's always a pleasure to be on your show. And like you rightly we were discussing prior to the show starting, that there are too many stakeholders in this war, and this war is becoming a millstone around a lot of people's neck, and it's consuming far too much of geopolitical capital at this point in juncture, and everybody is loath to let go. So that's the unfortunate scenario. Uh, to begin, the fundamental issue that we have to take stock of today is that the counteroffensive has begun. It's slow, but it's sure. Added to that was this whole incident of dam bursting, which has created its own complications. But there are certain elements that we need to take cognizance of, despite the counteroffensive having started. At best, Ukraine can get limited gains. No major breakthrough is likely. That's something which we need to take cognizance of. It will remain a war of attrition and with tremendous loss of life and damage to property and resources. The price, unfortunately, would be paid largely by the Ukrainians and to a degree by the Russians. There is, as the offensive progresses, and I visualize that another month or month and a half, there would be a possibility of a Russian repost.
Mhm.
As per my understanding, there are close to about 150 to 200,000 Russian soldiers who are ready, waiting behind the two trench lines, which are 600 miles long, and they will be utilized depending on how the situation uh, plays out and what are the kind of gains which the Ukrainians uh, get as a part of their offensives. The
So,
point we have to understand. Sorry, okay, go
may
ahead,
I, may
please.
I just,
Yeah,
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 I
yeah.
just want to ask you a small little thing here. You mentioned something about uh, just a small addendum, if I may, sir, with your permission.
Yeah,
You
yeah.
mentioned that the price will be paid by both these guys, but there is also obviously an additional price that the Europeans are also paying today, sir.
I was just coming to that.
Sir.
So, as the war lingers, the reality is that the interest in the war is getting l- incrementally lower and lower, purely because of the economic costs to the main supporters of Ukraine, that is the European Union and the Europe. We are already looking at how the Green Party in Germany and the Hungarians are against continuation and unlimited supply of weapons and equipment to Ukraine. There is a nuanced understanding, as per my reading and my talking to people, is that efforts are being done to make Ukraine accept some kind of a de facto ceasefire on terms which will become a little more clearer in another week or 2 weeks, depending on how the operations carry on. So, what we are basically looking at is that the war is going to linger on, but behind the scene, there would be an attempt, and I'll come to that issue a little later, to bring some kind of closure Now, terms of that closure is something that we will discuss in the latter part of our discussion. Uh, so, so what is the overall assessment? By and large, the offensive is unlikely to dent any major hole into the Russian defenses. Counteroffensive will at best make some kind of gains, but it will largely peter out. As the summer comes, Russians, like I said, could launch their own major offensive. The main issue is the sustainability of the war effort. And when we're talking about the sustainability of the war effort, the problem is that the expenditure of ammunition and the high tech weaponry and equipment that they are getting from West is finite. And once that starts petering out, it starts getting consumed, then the problem will come about how to recoup it. And as of now, as things stand today, the recouping level of the West are getting hugely distorted. They do not have the capacities. The capacities are coming down. So, question at that point in time would be, how will the Russians utilize the situation, and what are the kind of sustainable support which the West can provide? And this is a very sensitive point in the war, because West has leveraged Ukraine as a linchpin to degrade the military capabilities of Russia, and also simultaneously economically decapacitate Russia. Both, unfortunately, both the aims, although the propaganda says that the Russians are suffering, etc., 1:7, etc., etc., there is a counter narrative by Colonel McGregor and other parties and all whom at least we follow, and Messerhammer, who says that the damage is much more on the Ukrainian side.
Mm.
So, so the point is that in this context, West, how will the West continue with this war? Because if the war ends, or the war reaches a stage where the offensives are petering out, no major gains, Russians are standing by. So technically speaking, that would be a stage, say let's say in July or August or September maybe, would be a stage where Russians are not militarily defeated. They're hanging fire. In fact, they are showing greater degrees of capacities and capabilities. Like for example, they have in 2 years' time they have revamped their weapon system and recreated new weapon systems, and that's something phenomenal. And on top of that, economically, Russia is not only suffering but is doing well, 2.5% GDP growth rate. So this would mean that the entire edifice of creating a NATO or a Western solidarity post Afghanistan would suffer a deep blow. And if you notice that, and if you carefully read the G7 summits outcome documents and statements, you'll realize that there is a degree of concern, and the whole statement and the separate statement in Ukraine was framed with one single purpose in mind, and that single purpose was to ensure that the coalition allies stick together,
Mhm.
reason it out till the new strategies are found, and how and to create. And there is an added element to that. The added element to this whole issue, in when you start looking at the geopolitical narrative panning out, is that there is an attempt. to, like I said, uh, keep the flock together and ensure to brazen it out, particularly, and this is relevant, particularly when we saw this the Hiroshima document come out, is the fact is that there is a concern among the United States that how can they do a dual containment strategy. So if China is emerging as a major challenge to us, are we not spending far too many capital and time and effort in a European continental war, which is unwinnable at best, and when at the most it will not create the kind of, kind of a scenario that they were trying to look at. So under these circumstances, the dilemma which is being faced is this: support wearing thin. Number two, dual containment strategy under sphere control. I mean sphere challenge. They are trying to create minilaterals in Asia and try to revamp the ally system to stand up firm to the Chinese uh, attrition. I mean, not Chinese attrition, but the Chinese attempts at coercion. The Chinese, there is a back channel with the China, and that back channel did not yield result. And the back channel, but really not really a back channel, but it was the 10th and 11th May meeting that took place between Sullivan and Mangi. That was basically one of the aims was to how do we figure out see, the Chinese have pushed forward their agenda of trying to bring about some kind of a peace, but that's not working. So under the circumstances, the problem which is being faced by the West at this particular point in time is that not enough stress is being put on the Russians. Russians are standing firm. Putin, there is no challenge to Putin at this particular point in time. And on the other hand, all the pressure is on the West to support a country, Ukraine, which is fighting with its men and material a war which it should not be really be fighting, and looking for some kind of a ceasefire, which is not being allowed to happen. And the result is that there is a huge amount of not only casualties and destruction in Europe, but the effects of that is being felt globally. And as a result, the G7 stand isolated. Two-thirds of the world is either neutral or not supporting the West. So that's the scenario, sir.
So you brought it out very, very succinctly. The issue that I see, and this is something which I've kind of thought about for quite a while. I guess the thought process of getting the war to some sort of a conclusion, some sort of a peace, some sort of a settlement, kuch to, I mean, stop the fighting. And I liked what Trump said, stop the killing, stop the
Yeah.
bleeding, and that's something
Yeah.
which is interesting.
Mm.
But when you look at the leaders today, sir, calling Putin a killer, Zelensky has, I don't know, I mean, he's gone far beyond retreat, if I may. You have Tony Blinken, who's been talking about various things. Boris Johnson, of course, he's no more there in the game. The issue that I'm trying to say is that there is so much personal capital involved, personal political capital involved in this game by both the sides. How do you stand up and talk? Now, a lot of people will give a counter saying that, yeah, in politics, all this happens. You do all this stuff and then but this has gone a little far ahead. And of course, too much blood has also been spilt. How do you kind of bring it out to
See,
that point?
so I see there is a deep state in the United States by Newlands and the likes of that, and the Heidelberg Group, which met secretly in Portugal. They are keen to continue with the war. And I give you example of two narratives which has come out today. Economist says, Economist magazine, which says the way to defeat Putin. The headline of that article, which is a 9-minute read article, is How to Defeat Putin. Okay? And it believes that all the elements of power that Ukraine requires are in place for Ukraine to make major gains. There is another article which came out 3 days back in the Foreign Policy by a very intelligent thinker who says this war is unwinnable. You must have heard about Fiona Hill's arguments on this whole issue, where she has categorically said is that even the elite establishment in the United States is now questioning the necessity of this war. So, essentially speaking, the American state is looking for means to pull out. The sad part is that at this point in time, Biden is stuck. He wants a face saver.
Hmm.
How will that face saver come? That's something which is an issue which I'll discuss in the second part of this thing. How the war termination can take place and what should be the uh, what are the only options available with them. The as far as Chinese are concerned, Chinese have in his third term, Mr. Xi Jinping wants to play an elder statesman of the world. He showed his colors by bringing about peace between Iran and Saudi Arabia. He is trying to be a peacemaker in even in Saudi Arabia, trying to bring Israel and Saudis together. Incidentally, interestingly, his envoy has been to both Ukraine and Russia, and the whole effort is being made is to bring about ceasefire, limited effort of ceasefire. The terms and conditions of that are being negotiated by them. The question here is that when the back channel took place, and then some, according to some elements, the back channel also included the CIA chief's recent visit to China, which was basically not an intelligence visit, but basically taking a set of proposals up and down. There is no meeting ground coming up as yet. There is too much of distrust between the Americans and the Chinese at this particular point in time. Putin's removal is the center point of the West strategy at this particular point. And the belief is that if Putin is removed, Russian state will have a new leader with whom they can perhaps do this thing, but they do not want to do business with this killer, a murderer, or war criminal Putin. So they can't do a deal with Putin. Bringing about a political change in Russia is not easy at this particular point in time. And interestingly, when I'm discussing with you, today is Russia Day, and the latter part of the evening, I'm going to the Russian embassy for their annual party and a ballet. So what I'm trying to get at is basically is this: is that it's a catch-22 situation, and now there are two, three scenarios which the West and which can come about. First fundamental point, like we discussed, West has started to believe that it's an unwinnable war, and and there is a need to develop a vision to end the war. But the core belief remains that if there are sufficient gains made by this counteroffensive, then a situation can come about in which a peace proposals can be put forward. Now, this is what I call a, a very, very myopic thinking on the part of the West. Purely because, like we discussed, Russia has enough forces at its disposal to launch a counter offensive, a riposte, as we call it in the forge. If the riposte will come, he cannot afford. And number two is that he has developed humongous amount of air capabilities, and his new system like Penicillin, which is a counter artillery target system, are so effective that he is going to be able to decimate most of the capacities and capabilities that these guys have been bringing in. No doubt there will be a huge price to pay. No doubt there will be casualties. No doubt there will be losses. But the point that has come about in these 15 months is this: while the West collectively cannot support Ukraine adequately with the weapon systems and ammunition, Russia single-handedly, under all the conditions of sanctions, can continue to support, get new weapon systems, and on a daily basis launch barrages of fire and spit fire, as they say, spew fire, as they say, on Ukraine. So this is the story. This is the story. Now, under these circumstances, what is the West game plan? Get some kind of gains from this counteroffensive, use back channels to bring Putin to the negotiating table, and attempt at seeking political concessions. If the political concession fails, then they will try and get what is called the a sort of a frozen peace kind of a scenario, uh, push Zelensky to accept the status quo for the moment, cease hostilities, allow Russia to consolidation time, and hopefully create conditions of a political settlement. Now, the problem in this whole scenario is this: the nature of political settlement. The West believes that they continue to hold a strong hand, they continue to hold the capacity and capability to inflict pain on Russia, and therefore they will set minimum set of demands, and those minimum set of demands would be either Crimea or some kind of a pullback or some kind of a ceasefire line, which is slightly different from the whatever it is. I mean, those are details that we can be worked out. But the question is, those will be discussed. I do not see under the present circumstances the Russians agreeing to it. So they are not going to agree to anything. So until and unless the West is willing, and I don't think Zelensky would be able to accept that, push Zelensky for a ceasefire and prevent the hostilities to continue. There is a logic behind all this. The logic behind all this is very simple. If the war cross 12 months, okay, then maintaining status quo becomes the only possible solution, because you cannot go back to status quo ante. Status quo ante is then is seen as a defeat, and if it is seen as a defeat, then it is politically unacceptable. Now the saddest part of this whole scenario is this, and that's the saddest part, is that Ukraine is suffering materially, humanly, in every possible way, and fighting a war for the West, just like the Taliban was being used to kill Russia in Afghanistan in 1979. The same scenario is being played out. But the unfortunate part over here is that it is being played out on the home ground of Russia. And Russia has a backup resources, capacities, capabilities, and has the technological and economic resilience because of its resources to continue to fight this war. So this is what the story is, sir, at this point in time. I'm sure you have a lot of questions for me.
So the interesting, I mean, you've brought out something very interesting, that there can be a central middle ground, and you've also, on the counter said the Russians would not agree to it, and that tells me only one little thing, that today the Russians have the capacity of actually fighting and defeating the Western effort in Ukraine. Uh, there are these little pinpricks that keep happening in Belgorod and this and that and all that stuff, which is I mean, it's part of the game. Let's not forget that. You fight a war, you should be ready to take a punch. So that's how it is. But my main question is that with the kind of the areas that the Russians have occupied today, you've got, let's say, from the north, you've got the Donbass, you've got the Donetsk, the Luhansk region. Luhansk
Mhm.
is fully under the control of the Russians. Donetsk is now, I would say, about half under the control. You still have to go through those cities of Sloviansk and Kramatorsk and all that. In the south, you've got these large cities
Yeah.
in European context, Melitopol and Mariupol, and then towards this side, you've got the Zaporozhye region and the Kherson. Now the Russians have very clearly said these regions are not going back. So territorial discounts or some sort of a territorial give up would be the name of the game for the Ukrainians. It's not possible that the Russians would move back, because that would be a strategic defeat for them. So how do you see this particular thing with the strength that the Russians have, and with the geopolitical and military realities, sir?
See, sir, as far as territorial construct is concerned, the areas which are with the Russians at this particular point in time was was with Slavic Russians. They are Slavic Russian dominated areas, uh, and and where the war has been waging since 2014, and with huge amount of casualties to them, particularly perpetrated by the uh, Slavic Ukrainians. So, as far as these areas are concerned, the essentially speaking, the war was always to control these areas, to create a Slavic Russian buffer between the territory of Russia and the territory of Ukraine. And it is not
Novorossiya.
at this, sorry?
Novorossiya, that's what they called it. Yes, sir.
Yeah. To the issue is not so much again between Ukraine and Russia. Ukraine is a proxy for the West. And if you notice, two issues have come up. Last 2 days, a statement has been made by the NATO, that Borrell fellow, to say that we will accommodate NATO, Ukraine in one form or the other. And there is a 5 point proposal which is being mooted to induct Ukraine as a near NATO member, not with which Article 5 will not be applied, but Article 4 will be applied. It will include consultations with Ukraine. It will include building up the Ukrainian defense and military capacities, and creating Ukraine once again as a bulwark against Russia. The Russian dilemma is this: the anti or a NATO oriented force of geographical areas have increased with Finland joining the
Yeah.
NATO. So Russians are aware of the fact, given there is a huge amount of history involved in this. I don't want to go into the history, but they are aware of the fact is that given that historical perspective, given the fact that Russia will never be accommodated as a as a European power, there will always be a NATO threat on its borders. And to that extent, Russia will always have to be cognizant of, of the NATO's challenge. Now there are two interesting facets that emerge. One facet is that if Ukraine cannot achieve its strategic gains and Ukraine sets for peace terms, that will create a narrative in Europe of this Pax Americana under the context of NATO extending eastward was a foolish and a futile attempt which we should not have agreed to, and we must not accept this and look forward for some kind of a modus vivendi of existence with the Russians.
Hmm.
Okay. The second part is that if certain degrees of breakthroughs are achieved, and the Ukrainian forces push towards the Russian territory or closer to Russian territory, and recapture huge areas again, then the narrative changes. Then the narrative goes is that Russians are not that strong, we must continue with the push, and therefore the Ukrainian offensive will continue. Now, these are the two dynamics that are at play. And under these circumstances, I do not visualize how war termination can take place in a hurry until and unless there is a global pressure. And that's where, when we meet in G20, we meet in Global South, and that's why it is imperative for the rest of the world to put pressure to end this silly war. And I am also reading a very interesting internal narrative emerging in the United States is that the it is what is getting into question is not so much Ukraine, etc., 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 but the contextualness of the United States unipolarity. Can United States maintain its unipolar power? And there is one more element which is coming out of this war, and which is going to be relevant even for Indo-Pacific. Can a strong military power of the nature of United States able to sustain wars and conflicts by simply being an offshore balancer with its back ends exposed, with its back ends exposed to continental USA with huge lines of communications which are always can be intercepted. This is what the whole issue is, sir.
That's a big issue for a declining superpower, to kind of whose planning is embroiled in one and planning to get another war. So that's an interesting this thing. So globally, one thing that we've seen is that
Mhm.
people have very clearly pushed back the narrative of the Ukraine war, and we can see one by one countries just falling apart. Recently, the thing that gave me a bit of a jolt was how Olaf Scholz was greeted by Germans by calling him a warmonger. And that tells me, as what you were just currently telling me, that Europe is now going to be in a challenge. Uh, and Germany is Europe at the end of it. EU is Germany. I mean, if Germany falls, that's the end of pretty much the strength of the EU. So the narrative that I'm hearing in the US today is to put a bulwark against this old Europe, which is France and the Franco-German combination,
Mhm.
and to create a new Polish Lithuanian Commonwealth sort of a thing, which was the erstwhile setup, and to create that balancing factor within Europe, because they do realize that Western Europe might just fall. Uh, here is a war where the Americans are trying to be on the front foot, but day by day they have not. I've not seen the Americans being proactive right after probably the Nord Stream bombing, sir. We've seen them on the back foot itself. It's always been reactive. It's always been reactive. How do you see this sort of a geopolitical situation? The world is watching at the end of it. You have the Africans giving it back to the Europeans. You have small countries telling. I mean, Bangladesh told off the Americans very clearly. So that there's a pushback from the world because people saying, yeah, this is stupidity, and if you want to do this stupidity, then you're not the world power anymore. How do you see that context, and with the disintegrating Western coalition or alliance or whatever you may want to term it as?
See, there is a group or a set of people in the United States uh, who continue to believe that the power of the bomb is the decider. Okay, so they people like Newlands, etc., who
Neocons.
started the Orange Revolution and created this whole setup. They said we did all that and we are strong enough. And then what happened in the earlier stages of war when the Russians stupidly did what they did, they said that Russia is a defeatable power. So they are of the belief that we have to hang together and continue with our support to Ukraine and build Ukraine to a level that it will continue to bleed Russia, and in that bleeding of the Russia will become weak, and eventually the situation will come that you will be able to occupy territories, etc., etc. So that's one belief. There are other people who believe that this whole, and this is Europeans. Okay, you see what Macron does. Macron goes to China
Well,
and says categorically, we don't want to follow the footsteps of Chinese containment with the Americans are doing. He did something more interesting yesterday. He said, we are not in agreement of putting up a NATO plus in
yeah,
Asia with opening up our office in Japan.
Japan.
He- we talked about Scholz, and I told you about the Green Party. Green Party is a Nazi party. Use the old Nazi party. They are the ones now who are saying we don't want a war with Russia. They are paying the price. They all understand. I mean, they are using all kinds of alternative means to keep warm in the winter when there are two Nord Stream pipelines next to you. You had
Filled
opened the
with
tap,
gas and ready.
filled with gas. You are saying that some jerk is telling you not to use those. Pardon
Yeah,
my language. But you know, so this is
absolutely.
how. So, but this is the Franco German Europe. Okay, the Eastern Europe were also in the belief that their security lies in close alliance with the Americans. But they are suddenly realizing is that 82 Airborne Division or 101 Airborne Division located in Poland and Hungary and things like that, and their presence over there is not adequate, not enough when push comes to shove with fight with a country like Russia. People forget Russia fought in Stalingrad. Yeah? They suffered thousands and thousands and thousands of casualties. They're used to pain.
Yeah,
They're used to casualties. They will, and here in Afghanistan, they were fighting for some other nation and other people's objectives and other people's requirements. But here, you're fighting for nationhood. You're fighting for national pride.
yeah,
And for Russia, like for Americans, it's an opportunity to degrade Russia. It's similarly for the Russians, it's an opportunity by creating a strong buffer zone or sending a strong message to Europe that you have limited options but to accommodate Russia in Europe. And so, to me, this is not a war about Ukraine anymore. It is all about geostrategic grandstanding in Europe. And geostrategic grandstanding in Europe is essentially is between two power blocks. And here is another catch to it. And that catch is how much China will go to support a strong Russia. And up to what point is China willing to accept such strong Russia?
strong
And
Russia.
here again, the most interesting facet is that Russia controls all the resources which they want. And that is where they will have to accommodate, at least in the short to medium term. Later on, they can do what they feel like. So there is a new narrative which is coming on. It's called the Eurasian conglomeration or
Yeah,
a Eurasian get together narrative, which is coming out, in which the whole ideation is that starting from Eurasia, where you don't enter the Europe, but you are in from Eastern Europe up to the Vladivostok, the four or five countries combined: Russia, China, North Korea, Iran, and you can have in between any amount of other people who are willing to support you. They can get together to control not only what they call the heartland of Asia, or the Worth, Mackinder's theory of heartland, to also slowly and steadily controlling the waterways of what we call the rimland. So, if you start controlling the rimland and the heartland,
You're done.
where does an isolated America project its power from? And add to that, if the Mediterranean falls into this block's construct, so you have the West Asia, the Middle East, you have Eurasia. Eurasia means the Eastern Europe, up to the limit of the Eastern Europe, and right up to the Vladivostok. This whole continental landmass becomes part and parcel of one whole conglomeration centered
Mm.
around the Chinese and the Russian power structures or power. What will happen? So it's in a sense this grandstanding, this whole notion of fighting to the finish is a fight for survival of the two systems. That's how I look at it.
So the problem is that, as far as the West is concerned, they've backed on a horse that doesn't have the strength. I mean, you find a horse which is strong at least, na? They found a weak horse which has flaws, and they've got a leader like Zelensky who's not been able to be serious about this. I mean, his narratives have been flawed right from the beginning. They've concentrated more on the media war. The issue, and the last question that I'd like to ask you, is the credibility of the West in terms of the information which is there, information base which is there. A lot of people would trust the West for a lot of things. That credibility you've lost, and that to me is a big problem, because you may as well have the Ukrainians win the war on the ground, which is quite difficult, but your credibility as somebody who can tell the truth has taken a beat.
Exactly, sir. That's why if you were to use a chat GPT and push the New York Times reports for about 6 weeks or so, you will see the narrative changing.
Oh,
First is the major gains, then you suddenly it starts tempering down. No, there's something happening. They are being cautious about it, etc., etc., etc. Then they say no, there have been some losses, but they are not that serious losses. Uh, s- 28 drone attacks takes place, and all 28 drones are shot down. No, that kind of crazy narrative comes up. So the whole issue is that the world is unfortunately, sir, is not run by United States of America. The world, the Western world is run by what is called the globalists. The globalists run this world. The globalists have the power and influence over media. They have power of and influence over the military-industrial complex, and they, through back channels, shape the political narratives through their donations and everything else.
true.
So for them, Russia was anathema. And I always tell my Western friends is that for you, Russia is your Pakistan, your ideological enemy. They can live with China, but are they have a visceral, and you know why is that? During the Cold War, Russia successfully decolonized the world. Okay, they were responsible for decolonization world and accepting the decolonized world and under the thing. They,
Yeah, they would have. Mm.
yeah, the post-colonial system to a large degree and its efficacy to a large degree depended upon the Russians. And number two, even when the Russians used resources, etc., they were less exploitative than they were exploitive, but they were less exploitative than the West.
Yeah, that's there, sir.
So therefore, the large amount of the south, the global south, as they called it, and even in Asia, people have a certain degree of respect that the Russians are not an expansionist power,
Hmm.
whereas the United States and West are seen as an expansionist power. But let me also say it's important to have a strong and a united United States, primarily because it's important counterbalance to what the Chinese can do. Russians are away in one side. From us, our perspective, they are tucked away. But the Chinese are all over Asia. And as an Asian living in Asia who's feeling the force of coercion of the Chinese, the unilateral resurgence, the way in which the steadfastness in which they are trying to pursue their objectives, falsely, politically, manipulatively, the works, I would strongly will suggest that while we should see United States to be more rule-based in his own terms, but I would also suggest that I would not wish for United States to become weak player, and particularly at this current juncture of the global equations, where there's a global tug of war is going on.
Very nicely put. So that's a fear I keep having because as Indians we have this predominant, I won't call it a love affair, but affection towards Russia, and we also have that soft corner for the Americans. And today we actually find ourselves in this thing at who do you kind of look at because you want both of them to win.
So
The Americans lose, you got a problem. The Russians lose, you got a problem. So very nicely put, sir. So this was amazing. I think it's a very nice geopolitical aspect of the Ukraine war and the geopolitics around it. Uh, it's 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 at that juncture where things might just happen in the next month or two, and it's going to be interesting to kind of observe it as per what you said, and let's see how the developments actually fold out and roll over in
I
front of
hope
all
I
of us.
haven't put too much of my head in the chopper block, but I don't think so. I
No,
stand
sir.
by
I,
what
I,
I said.
I mean, in my little humble opinion, I have not been doing this as much as you have. You've probably got, 20, 30 times more experience than I have in this thing. But with a little research that I do, it's 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 a point in time where I think the West needs to sit and think as to what they want from this particular conflict. I think that's one thing which is missing in the entire Western narrative, and I think you brought that out very succinctly. Sir, thank you so much, and till next time for another deep dive into some interesting subject. Jai Hind, sir.
I love it. I love being on your show, and I love interacting. Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you, sir.
Yeah, yeah.
Jai Hind.